Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest Worth Publishers TLC Symposium, reviewing the DSM-5 changes, an open book workshop with Robin Rosenberg. We're so lucky to have Robin Rosenberg here today to review the major changes to the DSM-5. Robin is an assistant clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and is a clinical psychologist in private practice. In addition, she is the co-author, along with Stephen Koslin, of Abnormal Psychology, Psychology in Context, and Fundamentals of Psychology. She is board certified in clinical psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology. She received her master's and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Maryland, College Park. Before I turn over control to Dr. Rosenberg, I just wanted to go over one thing. You are currently muted, just so we can all hear Dr. Rosenberg clearly, but we definitely welcome your questions or comments. Feel free to either raise your we'll be holding the questions till the end during Q&A time. If you want to ask a question out loud, you can raise your hand. If you want to send us messages throughout the talk, or if you want to send in your message during the Q&A portion, you will type your question into the chat box. If you do not see the chat box during the presentation, all you have to do is hover over the green bar that will appear at the top of your screen, click the the chat icon, and it will bring up the box that I'm currently showing on the screen. I'll review this again when we get to the Q&A portion. So that is all that I have before turning it over to the person you really came to see, Dr. Rosenberg. And I am just turning over control right
now. Thanks very much, Andrea. Okay, can you see what's on my screen, Andrea?
I can.
Okay, great.
You just have to turn the PowerPoint into the presentation. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining me in working on the second edition of the Abnormal Psychology textbook with Worth. We were waiting for DSM-5 to come out, and so I got very immersed in the weeds, and I hope to walk you through some of the significant forest and weeds of the book. First, let me talk about why is there a DSM-5, and there are three main reasons, two that have been stated by the American Psychiatric Association. One is to reflect the state of the field. The DSM-4 was originally published over 20 years ago, and they were hoping, their stated reason was that the field has advanced such that they thought there was more biological understanding of disorders and their treatments, and they were hoping to incorporate that in a new manual. Unfortunately, when the working groups began their work, it became clear that we didn't know as much as they thought we knew, but they nonetheless continued to work on a new manual because the other reason is that they needed to harmonize with the new ICD, which is ICD-10, which I'll talk about in a moment, and that's because of the diagnostic codes, which, again, I'll talk about in a moment. The third reason of why there's a new manual, which they didn't talk about, is because it's a significant source of income for the American Psychiatric Association, and the only people buying DSM-4s now are new mental health clinicians. And with the conflict of interest stuff with Big Pharma, they're taking less money from Big Pharma, so there was a huge push financially for them. So that's why there's a new manual, even though most of us do not think that it's an improvement at all. ICD-10, it stands for International Classification of Disease. It's in its 10th edition. It's written under the auspices of the World Health Organization, and it is truly an international tool. It codes for diseases, injuries, and causes of death, and it's used around the world. It is the standard for both physical and mental disorders. ICD-10 was approved in 1994, the same year that DSM-4 was published. Everyone else in the world has been using ICD-10 for 20 years. We are supposed to switch over to ICD-10 October 1st of this year. However, stay tuned. Congress is voting on Thursday whether to push back our start date by a year. That mostly has to do with physician compensation with Medicare, but it may be pushed back, so follow the news on Thursday. ICD-11 is expected to be approved in 2015, and so once again, we'll be way behind the curve on that. ICD-10 has 4 times more codes than ICD-9, so it's much more detailed clinically. And the U.S. is the only country that uses a separate manual for mental health, which is our DSM. The new codes, if you open up, this is called an open book, if you open up your DSM-5, if you have one, for the beginning of a new section where there's a new diagnosis, you'll see the old code in black ink, you know, for example, with bulimia nervosa, 307.51. And then to the right of that, in parentheses in gray, is another number that looks unfamiliar. It's usually it will start with an F code, and that is the ICD-10 code. That's the diagnostic code. And on October 1st, for insurance billing, that's the code that you would need to use. Let me just walk you through ICD-10 briefly. It actually makes a lot of sense. There are chapters, if you will, and they group together related disorders and traits. So it's pretty straightforward. Anxiety disorders and things related to them are F40 through 48. So if you see something in the 40s, you know at a glance what kind of general kind of category of disorder it is. You can download the mental health part of ICD-10 for free. This is the website. If you want a PowerPoint, if you want a PDF file of this PowerPoint slide, just let Andrea know, but just do a Google search for WHO Blue Book classification, and you'll find it. To walk you briefly through it, the code in ICD-10 for panic attack is F41.0. The first character for our type of disorders is usually an F. The second character is a number. The others can be, you know, sometimes whatever, number, letter, and then there's often a decimal after the third character. So that it's quite straightforward. I didn't know this until I started working on the textbook and looking at ICD 9 and 10. They have their own criteria. So it's not simply that it's code numbers, but this is just a snapshot of F32.2, which is severe depressive episode without psychotic symptoms. So DSM has, you know, sometimes minor, sometimes a little bit more than minor differences with the criteria in ICD-10. But that's what all the fuss is when people are talking about why don't we just use ICD-10. They're not simply talking about the diagnostic codes. They're talking about the actual diagnostic guidelines. So interesting happening. We'll see how it plays out and whether there'll be a DSM-6. You can also download a sort of paragraph by paragraph overview of the DSM-5 changes, DSM-4 to DSM-5, and that's on DSM-5's website. And again, just do a Google search for the kind of intuitive terms and you'll find it. So an overview about DSM-5, they have some new categories or chapters, and some disorders have changed what chapters they're in. So if you go in the book and you can't find it where you think it should be, just look in the index because it may have swapped out into a different one. The organization of the book is they've taken things that they feel are more biologically rooted and manifest earlier, and those chapters or categories are earlier in the book, and they're also earlier within a chapter. So that's the organization. There's a rhyme or reason to it for them. There is no multi-axial system. Everything is basically axis 1, but there are no other axes. And so if people have multiple diagnoses, they would just have multiple diagnoses. And that's because, in fact, some of the things that you would think should have been on axis 2 were axis 1, and given the rationale for the old system, and vice versa. They've done away with the not otherwise specified kind of garbage dump category, if you will. It's now called not elsewhere classified, and it's, I don't know why the name changed. I mean, it functionally serves the same purpose. But there are two types of not elsewhere classified. One is where you as a clinician can specify. So for instance, someone's symptoms of bulimia nervosa don't meet the frequency cutoff. So you would say bulimia nervosa NEC, doesn't meet frequency criteria, or you might not specify, in which case it's NEC unspecified. Again, this is just how they've done it. I'm not going to talk about a lot of specifiers today, but there are many, many, many new specifiers in DSM-5, and I would strongly encourage you for first time or two that you're diagnosing someone using a DSM-5 manual is to pull out your DSM-4, pull out your DSM-5, and look at them side by side. Make sure and the specifiers to make sure that you understand the new disorder. All right, so I'm going to go in order both of chapters and disorders within a chapter, so you can flip through your DSM-5 as we're going and write in it if you like. I'm going to go quickly, but again, you can get a copy of this PowerPoint slide, and I'll be taking questions at the end. The first chapter, they're calling neurodevelopmental disorders, and it's instead of disorders in infancy, childhood, and adolescence. But a lot of disorders have been moved around. Some are in this category. Some that were in this category aren't in this category. So again, just keep posted on that and look for it. A big change is mental retardation is no longer the term that's used. It's called intellectual developmental disorder, and it is no longer anchored with IQ score, at least not in the criteria box. It's much more focused on the person's adaptive functioning level, and there are many pages of guidelines about how to make this diagnosis and also assess level of functioning. You may notice in my PowerPoint slides I'm using the word edit trace color coding. So red is for things that are deleted, and blue is for things that are new. Okay, whoops, something, okay. So I take a look at that disorder. PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, the old, what some people call the garbage dump category for the PDDs. That's now called global developmental delay. Again, if you diagnose that, take a look at it. The section on communications disorder, there are many new disorders, and the criteria for existing disorders have been tweaked. One controversial change is that they've gotten rid of the 4 PDD diagnoses, and they've combined them into one called autism spectrum disorder, although that has really fully been deleted. This is a controversial change in part because of access to services, and it will shift somewhat who's eligible, although the American Psychiatric Association says that it won't really change anything. Let me just walk you through, there's some changes. So one of the things is that they've collapsed the social interaction and social communication domains in criteria A. So as you can see, they're all together. There are 3 different ways that you can meet that criterion. You need both, you need all A, B, and C. You have to have, and B4, as you can see on the screen, is new, and that's the sensory kind of hyper or hyporeactivity. So no Asperger's. Asperger's is not even a subtype, which I think that we thought they might, that's what they were going to do. And it's the early developmental period in criterion C. They're not using any age cutoffs. For many of the neurodevelopmental disorders, they're just calling it in the early developmental period. ADHD, you can now diagnose it in adults, but you need 5 rather than the 6 symptoms that you need for children. Another change is that the symptoms can have been present before age 12, not age 7. And it's based on research, which the 7-year cutoff didn't really make a difference. And another change is that the onset of the symptoms, prior to earlier than age 12, didn't have to impair functioning. They just had to exist. So that's an important shift. If you diagnose learning disorders, the 3 R's, they've collapsed those into one called specific learning disorder, and then you would specify the type. At this point, let me say a word about the total number of disorders in DSM-5. Some of you may know that there was a lot of pushback with DSM-4. There were well over 300 disorders in DSM-4, and people complained that they were pathologizing normal, and people wondered what was going to happen with DSM-5. The DSM-5 folks promised there would be no increase in the total number of disorders from DSM-4 to DSM-5. One of the ways they've done that is a kind of accounting, playing with accounting. So as you can see with autism spectrum disorder, if you combine 4 disorders into one, then you have 3 extra slots, if you will. And they've used those slots to then add new disorders. So there are new disorders. Very few have been totally taken away, but they did keep the overall number relatively the same. But they did it, again, with these accounting methods. So we'll go through some of the new disorders that they've added later. In the neurodevelopmental disorders, you've got motor disorders and tic disorders. Again, if you diagnose these, I would take a careful look. The next chapter is schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, and they added the word spectrum. And then in order, delusional disorder, the main change in there is that they've gotten rid of the whole non-bizarre delusions, but they have a bizarre specifier. And you can no longer have shared psychotic disorder or folio 2. If someone has folio 2, they would still be diagnosed with delusional disorder. And then if they're away from the primary person and their symptoms subside, they would just not be diagnosed with the disorder anymore. Brief psychotic disorder is the same. Schizophrenic form is the same except for the changes I'm about to talk about with schizophrenia. So there are no subtypes because they weren't prognostically meaningful. People with schizophrenia would have their subtype change over time, so it just goes away. The bizarreness of delusions is no longer important. And then disorganized speech is now one of the must-have criteria. So in criterion A here, in the old days, you had to have at least delusions or hallucinations, number 1 or number 2. Now you can have 1, 2, or 3. You still need to have 2 symptoms, but disorganized speech is one of the options for a must-have. Schizoaffective disorder, they've definitely changed that, and you have to have had mood symptoms for the entire course of the psychotic illness, which makes it a longitudinal diagnosis. And part of the reason for that change is that they didn't want people being diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder if they had depression in response to having schizophrenia. So there are some changes about the timing. There are also some more detailed changes about the timing of mood episodes and psychotic episodes. So take a look at that. This is definitely a significant change. Catatonia has been added as a specifier for other disorders so that you can, again, make that diagnosis as a specifier. And they've divided mood disorders into 2 chapters or 2 categories. In bipolar disorder, they still have 1 and 2. And in a manic episode, they've added an energy component in criterion A that you can see here. And they also have added new specifiers of mixed features and anxious distress. You can no longer have a mixed episode for any mood disorders. If someone has mixed, what we would have called mixed episode, you have to sort of say it's predominantly one or the other, but it has features of other types of mood episodes. So that's a change. In cyclothymia, there are a significant number of changes. So you can see in A, sort of underlined there, and in B, during the 2-year period, the hypomanic and depressive periods have been present for at least half the time, and the person has not been out without symptoms for 2 months, and the criteria for any mood episode have never been met. In DSM-4, it was have not been met in the first 2 years. So if someone with what would appear to be cyclothymic disorder but has previously had a full-blown mood episode, they would need to have their diagnosis changed. So that's, again, a change. And And then, as I said, there's no more mixed episode, but mixed features is a specifier. Depressive disorders has a lot of new diagnoses. Disruptive Mood Dysregulation Disorder, which was originally going to be called Temper Dysregulation Disorder, and the whole idea behind that diagnosis was to address all the kids who were getting diagnosed incorrectly with bipolar disorder and put on heavy-duty meds. And so they really wanted to understand more about those kids, kind of separate them out from the very rare but true cases of pediatric bipolar disorder. And my understanding is that at one point it was proposed that those kids be, a better diagnosis would be intermittent explosive disorder, but there was pushback from some folks who felt that parents wouldn't want that diagnosis for their kids. So they decided to then make it temper dysregulation disorder. And then when there was pushback about the name of that disorder, they changed it to disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. They've played up the mood symptoms, and they've actually changed the criteria for intermittent explosive disorder to better separate them now. So if you diagnose this kind of IED and disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, you may want to take a look at those two disorders side by side. Major depressive disorder, big change was they took out the bereavement exclusion. So what that means is if someone is grieving, which can absolutely mimic the signs of depression, and they go see a mental health clinician or their internist, and they talk about their sadness and tearfulness, they may be diagnosed with depression and offered medication. So this is very controversial. We'll see what happens if it sticks. Their APA says that DSM-5 is a living document, so they can kind of change things at will. So we'll see if they keep the bereavement exclusion. They say that there was research to justify that. Okay. Another big change is to dysthymia, which they've renamed persistent depressive disorder. It is now, according to DSM-5, impossible to have what we used to call double depression. So let me just show you here. One thing is in criterion B, you used to have 3 symptoms. Now it's only 2, so they lowered the threshold. And the big, huge change is in criterion D. So if someone has major depression for 2 years, they will be diagnosed apparently not with major depression, but with persistent depressive disorder. So it was different in DSM-4. It was that they didn't have a manic depressive episode for the first 2 years. So we'll see, again, with the living document, if they bring back or sort of self-correct and say, no, you can have both persistent depressive disorder and major depression. But that's a really big change. They've added in premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which was in the appendix in DSM-4, despite some pushback about that. And then the next chapter is anxiety disorders. And it starts with separation anxiety, because again, that's the thing that they felt had the earliest symptom profile. And then added adults can now be diagnosed with this disorder, but for adults, the symptoms have to last for at least 6 months. Selective mutism is in the anxiety disorders. The specific phobias here, as you'd expect. Social anxiety disorder, they've kind of swapped what's in the paragraph, parentheses. And they've made some other changes. It used to be in criterion A that people were anxious socially with unfamiliar people, but now they've changed that to it's possible scrutiny by others. Criterion B has been revamped, and they've also done away with the wording about that the person knows the fear is excessive. That's gone. In criterion C, you don't have to have had a panic attack, but it's that social situations almost always provoke fear or anxiety. And then in criterion E, they have new wording for many of the anxiety disorders. That it's not that it's excessive, it's that it's out of proportion to the actual threat posed by the social situation, or in the case of specific phobia, to the object and to the sociocultural context. The other interesting thing is the assumption is that this disorder is generalized. so there's no generalized specifier anymore. If it's not generalized, if it's performance only, then you would have a specifier. Agoraphobia is its own diagnosis, so someone can have panic disorder, can have agoraphobia, or one or the other. And then the main change from sort of the description that they'd had about agoraphobia is that you need fear or anxiety in 2 situations, 2 out of 5, and that's to distinguish it from specific phobia. Okay. Generalized anxiety disorder is here, but it has nothing new. And then, as I said, they've changed some of the language. Instead of excessive or unreasonable, it's out of proportion. OCD has been moved out of anxiety disorders and has its own category or chapter, which we'll move on to next, as does trauma and stress disorders. OCD has some changes. They've also created its own category, which we'll see things that are related to it. But for OCD, the main thing is they've gotten rid of some of the obsessional criteria, the numbered criteria, streamlined. There are only 2 now, and that they note that these symptoms are intrusive and unwanted, because unwanted wasn't in there before. Body dysmorphic disorder has moved into here from somatoform disorders and has had some significant changes. So if you diagnose this, please do take a look at it carefully, because their criterion B is new, and it's a behavioral component. It's about that there are either repetitive behaviors or mental acts. And again, the compulsive aspect is to make it fit better with OCD in that category. And there's a new specifier for muscle dysmorphia, which is typically for guys who work out at the gym. A new disorder here is hoarding disorder. They felt there was enough research to justify kind of pulling it out and having it be its own thing. Trichotillomania has a new criterion where the person is trying to decrease or stop the hair pulling. They have a new diagnosis for skin picking or excoriation disorder that's also very controversial. And that's it for this category. The next category is trauma and stressor-related disorders. This is new, and so they've pulled out from other places. We've got reactive attachment disorder, and then there was a subtype of that, which was a disinhibited social engagement disorder. That's new. It's its own diagnosis now. PTSD, of course, is here, and they've added a separate criteria table for PTSD in those 6 and under. And they've also made some significant changes, and I'm just going to walk you through those. It used to be that you had to have for an event to qualify as a traumatic event. It used to be something that you responded to with horror. They took that out because, of course, everyone responds to traumatic events with horror. They've gotten rid of the threat to physical integrity of self or other, and they've really tightened up what constitutes a traumatic event, because there was a lot of concern after 9/11 and people watching all of the horrible events and felt that they got PTSD and in fact it qualified in DSM-4 under traumatic event. So now it's exposure to actual or threatened death. This is criterion A, serious injury or sexual violence, and they've made that very explicit here. For A2, you have to witness in person, and then there's a note under A4, which is, unless it's work-related, seeing it through electronic media doesn't count. So for those with patients who kept watching over and over and over again, volitionally, that kind of witnessing wouldn't count. In criterion B, it used to be called re-experiencing symptoms. They're now called intrusive symptoms, and it used to be 3 or more. Now it's 1 or more. As you can see, there are only 5 symptoms in criterion B. They've shuffled some around and renamed them, so look at it really carefully. Criterion C, it used to be called numbing, now it's called avoidance. Criterion D is new. It's negative alterations in cognition and mood. and they've kind of taken some that used to be in other ones, and then they've added some new criteria. So 2 through 4 are new to this edition of DSM. And in D7, which used to be in a different section, it used to be restricted range of affect, but in fact, people with PTSD have plenty of range at the lower end, sort of the negative end, so they've kind of honored that, and it's an inability to experience positive emotions. In criterion E, they've added reckless and self-destructive behavior. And then acute stress disorder has analogous changes. I'm not going to go into them here, but again, crack open DSM-4 and DSM-5 side by side so you can understand the changes that they've made. Interestingly, adjustment disorders is here because it's in response to stress, but it's a single disorder. So I don't know why they kept the plural, but they did. And so you can distinguish among different types of adjustment disorders by specifiers, so with anxiety, with mood. So that's here now. In the dissociative disorders category, they've made some changes to DID, I think in response to some of the criticism, and they've added possession trance, as you can see in criterion A, and it's the main thrust of the wording is this discontinuity in self and sense of agency. And then B, C, and D are all new. So take a look at that and side by side with your DSM-4. Dissociative amnesia is pretty much the same, except dissociative fugue, which was its own disorder, is now a specifier of dissociative amnesia, which makes sense, and it was incredibly rare, except in TV shows and movies. With depersonalization disorder, they've added derealization because if you had only derealization, you would have been diagnosed with DD-NOS, and so depersonalization by itself was actually quite rare. So that's a change. So they've expanded depersonalization options and added in derealization. Okay, somatoform disorders they've changed the name and substantially changed all of the disorders in the category. They've said that part of the reason for the changes is because most of these disorders are diagnosed by primary care physicians who had a hard time understanding and working with the somatoform disorders. So ironically, a manual for mental disorders was changed to make it easier for non-mental health physicians. They also did make some changes that make a lot of sense because somatization disorder, which is gone, was incredibly hard to diagnose because that was one where you had to have 2 symptoms of this type of illness, 3 symptoms of this type. But there were many people who didn't meet all the criteria but clearly needed mental health treatment. So I'm going to talk about some of the specific changes in a minute, but in general, they've done away with the concept of medically unexplained symptoms because we now know enough that oftentimes we just don't know enough to explain it, or our technology for diagnosis isn't good enough, but that doesn't mean someone doesn't, in fact, have something medically wrong with them. Okay, for somatic symptom disorder, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and the idea here, and it's all new, is that someone has a medical problem. They have somatic symptoms that are distressing or impair functioning in some way. But that's not enough. The main point is in criterion B, which is in their response to it, which is basically it's disproportional, they have a lot of anxiety, or they spend a lot of time and energy related to these. So it's not, so there are 2 key points. One is that the person has somatic symptoms, and then the other is that their response seems to be excessive or inappropriate. Now, this is distinguished from a new diagnosis called illness anxiety disorder, which is replacing hypochondriasis, because hypochondriasis was actually, there were 2 sets of people diagnosed with this. One of people who did have somatic symptoms, And those people would now be diagnosed with somatic symptom disorder. And then the other group who were diagnosed with hypochondritis didn't really have anything major wrong with them, but they were preoccupied that they either thought they did or that they might. So in illness anxiety disorder, it's, again, the theme here is preoccupied with acquiring or having a serious illness. And if they do have any somatic symptoms, they're mild. So this, too, focuses on the person's kind of over-responsiveness. And they engage in checking behaviors. A little OCD thing there. But it's distinguished from SSD because they don't have significant somatic symptoms. Okay? All right, so those are the two new diagnoses. Thought conversion disorder is still there, but they've taken out that the psychological factors or stress are associated with the symptoms, and they've taken out feigning because it's just too hard to tell sometimes about feigning. And just make the disorder anyway, make the diagnosis anyway. Factitious disorder is no longer its own category. It's here, and there are now two types. Factitious disorder imposed on self, and then factitious disorder imposed on another. It was factitious disorder by proxy, also called Munchausen's disorder by proxy. And basically, it's typically what it was. The concept hasn't changed. It's just changed where it is. And the code will change. Okay, and pain disorder is gone because it just wasn't really helpful to imbue psychological meaning into it, and typically people with chronic pain are now referred to pain clinics, so it's just not in here at all. Eating and feeding disorders have been combined. That's the next chapter. And both pica and rumination disorder can now be diagnosed at any age. There was a disorder called feeding disorder of infancy and early childhood. It's been tweaked to capture teens and things that used to be in NOS, and it's called ARFID, or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. I think of this as the white food only disorder. It's people who are significantly malnourished because of either color or sensory properties of food. They're incredibly restrictive. Anorexia nervosa, main change is that you don't have to have amenorrhea, and they've taken out the 85% body weight criteria, so it's just significantly low body weight in criterion A. And then they've gotten rid of, in criterion B, the refusal to maintain body weight because it imbues intentionality, but rather in B, they've just persistent behavior that interferes with weight gain. I don't understand why, but they don't have a duration criterion here. They put it in the subtypes. What can I tell you? And bulimia nervosa, they have some significant changes. They're no longer subtypes because longitudinally people changed what subtype they had, so it wasn't prognostic in any way. And they've lowered the threshold. It used to be that the binging and purging had to occur twice a week, and it's now once a week. Binge eating disorder, which was in the appendix in DSM-4, is now in the regular part of the manual. And the main changes, they've lowered the threshold. It used to be you had to have binge eating twice a week for 6 months, and now it's once a week for 3 months. I'm not going to talk about, but you should know the next chapters are elimination disorders and then sleep-wake disorders, and where there are some changes in the sleep-wake disorders. In sexual dysfunctions, the good news is that for women, the emphasis is away from desire, excitement, and the orgasm cycle, because it actually didn't apply very well to women, and they're focusing more on pleasure and the experience. And for men, they're focusing even more on orgasm and the penis, to the point where in premature ejaculation, it's based on how quickly a man comes to orgasm. In a woman's vagina, is it in 0 to 15 seconds, 15 to 30, or 30 to 60? Anal intercourse or oral intercourse are not included in premature ejaculation because they said they didn't have any data on how soon is too soon. And just kind of interesting to, it would be interesting for you just to read those criteria tables. I don't want to go into them in detail. The main things to know is that there's a minimum 6 months duration now, and the criteria are more precise. They've combined dyspareunia and vaginismus because they typically co-occur, and I'm not even going to bother to say the names of some of these new disorders. And they've combined female hyposexual disorder and female arousal disorder because for women they tend to go, again, they go together affecting each other, and so they've combined them, and they've added a male hypoactive sexual desire disorder. And they've taken out sexual aversion entirely. And that's the sexual dysfunctions. Gender dysphoria, a lot of language change, including the name of the disorder itself instead of gender identity disorder. So instead of calling it the other sex, they're calling it some alternative gender. Instead of cross-gender identification, they're calling it gender incongruence. And then interestingly, this is probably the only case in the manual where the transsexual community pushed appropriately for this new language that I just talked about, but at the same time, in order for people post-transition to have access to treatment, including have insurance pay for hormones, they need to have a diagnosis. And so the American Psychiatric Association added a new specifier for post-transition. There are new duration criteria for adults, and then there's a separate new criteria box for children. So if you diagnose this, please take a look at these. And they've also deleted the affectional preference because it was irrelevant. In disruptive impulse control and conduct disorder, for oppositional defiant disorder, there are new specific cutoffs, which is good. So as you can see, they're more specific here for vindictiveness, and in criterion B, it's much more specific about the disturbance in behavior and who it affects. Intermittent explosive disorder, which I talked about earlier, as I said, the criteria are new or tweaked, and there's a minimum age of 6 years. So if it's under 6, they might in fact get diagnosed with the disruptive mood depressive disorder. Conduct disorder has some new specifiers that relate to psychopathy, because kids who are diagnosed with conduct disorder, some subset of them go on and often become psychopaths, and so the specifiers are trying to identify those kids early on. So there are things like no capacity for empathy, or kind of prototypical emotions, but not sort of primitive emotions. Pyromania and kleptomania are here in this category. A big change. Substance-related disorders now is called and addictive disorders. And so gambling disorders here, opening the door for things like internet addiction or chocoholism or other kinds of addictive disorders. Like in DSM-4, it's substance-specific, but I'm going to talk about them combined, sort of just call it substance use disorder for learning purposes. So what they've done is they've taken away abuse. They kind of merged abuse and dependence because a lot of people felt that it was not a useful distinction. And so they combined all the criteria, but they deleted legal problems because I think that wasn't, if you were smart and could avoid legal trouble, it doesn't mean that you didn't have a substance use problem. And they've added craving, which is number 4 here. So they've merged them all. And abuse, you needed 1 criterion. Dependence, you needed 3. So they've kind of compromised, and now you need 2 of the following. And then the severity is based on how many symptoms you have over 2. And then withdrawal, they've gotten more specific about what it means to have withdrawal. Okay. So substance intoxication and withdrawal are here, and they've added caffeine and cannabis withdrawal. Why they added caffeine withdrawal, I don't know. I mean, you get a headache if you stop drinking coffee if you're used to it. And then they've also made these criteria to apply to tobacco use disorder, and they've added a bunch of specifiers. They deleted polysubstance abuse, and just if someone has polysubstance abuse, you would just note each specific disorder. And that's that. We're getting near the end. I'm going to talk about neurocognitive disorders a bit. So delirium, the main change is that they've changed the wording from a disturbance in consciousness to attention and awareness, but take a look at the criteria. And then they got rid of amnestic disorder and dementia due to, Alzheimer's or traumatic brain injury, whatever it was. And they've created 2 new disorders that don't correspond to anything that neurologists diagnose. One is called Major Neurocognitive Disorder due to, and that would be to, Parkinson's, to Lewy bodies, to Alzheimer's. So that's similar to dementia and amnestic disorder combined, where it's a cognitive disorder. And then they added something called mild neurocognitive disorder, which is incredibly controversial. And I'm going to walk you through both of these so you can understand why. You would think if they were calling it major neurocognitive disorder, it should be minor neurocognitive disorder, but the DSM-5 folks felt that that would be minimizing it, and people wouldn't pay attention to it, so they're calling it mild. So let me show you what it is. So you have to have a modest decline from a previous level of performance. In A1, the individual, someone else in the individual's life, or the clinician needs to have concern that there's been a mild decline, and that in A2, there has to be some kind of quantified clinical assessment. Okay? So in criterion A, what we see is anyone who is aging, who is getting older, and normal aging will have a modest decline in performance. It will undoubtedly be of concern to the person or people in that person's life, and it will be able to be documented on any standard test that has response time. So this is not relative to the person's age. It's not based on norms for the person's age, only to the person's own performance, previous performance. So anyone sort of once they hit 60 at least will begin to exhibit the cognitive decline, and whether they're concerned or not, many of us are concerned as we get older. And then B, the deficits do not interfere with the capacity for independence. So there's no impairment. And there doesn't even have to be distress. The person just is concerned, or someone in the family is concerned. So this is definitely, this is a disorder now. Someone has a DSM-5 diagnosis simply because they're aging and are concerned about the normal cognitive decline in aging. All right, so that's that disorder. In contrast, major neurocognitive disorder is a significant decline that substantially impairs functioning and interferes with everyday life. So the main drawback of major neurocognitive disorder is that people who are diagnosed with this will not, and their loved ones will not understand it because their neurologist has diagnosed them with something else, like dementia due to Alzheimer's. So why are they getting a different diagnosis from their mental health clinician? So this is sure to cause confusion, and we'll see what happens if there's a DSM-6. Personality disorders has no change. I can talk about that at the Q&A, but it was a huge brouhaha, and then at they wouldn't accept the proffered changes, and there wasn't time to do any new changes, so it stayed within, but there's an alternate in the book in the appendix, or actually sort of before the appendix, but there are no changes. Paraphilic disorders, they've changed the language, so you can have a paraphilic interest, and that's not a disorder. It becomes a disorder if it causes significant distress or impairment, or for a non-consenting partner, it causes harm or risk of harm. So if you diagnose these disorders, please look carefully. Transvestic disorders no longer limited to heterosexual males, and they have some new specifiers that can be important for those diagnosing disorders in this category. Finally, let me tell you a little about the DSM-5 process. After the working groups met, their goal was to have 10,000 clinicians participate in field trials, which is good because you want to know whether the new disorders and criteria are reliable and valid. 5,000 clinicians signed up to participate. 195 finished training for it, and only 70 enrolled any patients in the trials. Their APA said nearly 150 patients have joined the study. So out of the 20,000 patients they were hoping to have in the first field trial, which was just pilot testing the working group's new criteria or changing criteria, they had 150, and they canceled the second field trial where they would have tightened up the criteria. Ostensibly, they said they canceled it because the DSM-5 was originally supposed to be published a year earlier, but it got pushed back, and so they no longer had time to do the second field trial. Why did they no longer have time to do it? That's never been made clear. It's not clear why they couldn't have pushed the publication date back, since we're not switching over to ICD-10 until October of this year. And in fact, in May of last year is when DSM-5 came out. So that's the DSM-5 process. And of course, in the field trials, they were using criteria that were often poorly worded because they were only as good as the best writer in the working group. 2 fantastic books about the process for those interested. I highly recommend Gary Greenberg's book, Book of Woe. And then Alan Francis, who has a Psychology Today blog. His book, I personally found less interesting, but interesting. Gary Greenberg's book also talks about some of Alan Francis's views as well. So that's it, and I'm ready to take questions. Andrea,
I'm not sure how to
take questions.
No, I was taking myself off of mute. Yes, so the first question that has come through was, why is agoraphobia separate from specific phobia?
That's a really great question. And part of it is that with agoraphobia, people tend to have a special friend that they will do things if someone else does it with them. They'll leave the house, they'll go in a tunnel, they'll go over a bridge if someone else does it with them. And that's typically not the profile with specific phobia. And so agoraphobia is much more likely to interfere in a more global way in someone's life than specific phobia.
Great.
Does that answer? Okay.
I'm assuming so, but if not, you could send us a chat and we can expand upon that. The second question is, what was the purpose of the mild neurocognitive disorder if distress or impairment is not a factor? And then the second part of the question is, if it's the same as normal aging, what will the treatment be?
Great questions. So, I think there was an admirable goal, which is for Alzheimer's, there are now some medications in the pipeline that appear to work in kind of delaying the worst onset of symptoms if it's caught early. This is a larger issue, actually, about sort of subclinical symptoms in general. So it's honorable to try to catch things early, and then we can do research on it longitudinally. And the problem is that any DSM serves many different masters, and basically as a manual that's used by insurance. If a diagnosis is in there, it's saying it's a disorder. And so when you start diagnosing subclinical things, for research purposes, it's fantastic, right? It absolutely, it's sort of like if someone's blood pressure is a little bit high, but not high enough for high blood pressure, you do a kind of watch and wait, or you do some additional testing, but they're not diagnosed with high blood pressure. So the problem is that DSM serves many different masters, and so researchers in the United States use it and they would use a sort of subclinical diagnosis to catch things early. Another example of this is one of the proposed diagnoses was attenuated psychosis syndrome, and the idea was to catch people who were at risk by history or by other features for schizophrenia, and if we can catch them early, there's some indications to suggest that medicating them at a lower dose would forestall symptom development. But then but not everyone who has subclinical symptoms will go on to get it. And so they didn't end up including it in the manual. It's in, I think it's in the appendix, because there were a lot of false positives. So the reason that mild is in there was they felt they were doing enough of a service for, I guess, for research purposes that outweighed it. But it really, I mean, I think that they and we as a country and NIMH as a funding agency need to decide if you're going to fund subclinical things, isn't there a way to note them without having them be a disorder? And in fact, of course, immediately on when DSM-5 came out, NIMH did an absolute 180 from past research funding, saying they would not use DSM-5 as a way to sort of categorize people in any research grants going forward. Whereas in the past, they were using DSM-4 very heavily as a way to categorize people for in research projects. So I hope I answered that question.
Thank you, Robin. There is a follow-up question to that question. The question is, but then isn't there an issue with the lack of collaboration between the mental health world and the medical world?
Yes, absolutely. And again, part of the push, I think, by some people for using ICD-10 instead of DSM is that ICD is used by medical people everywhere. And so that part of the issue is that, you know, the United States is the only country that has its own separate sort of manual for mental disorders. So, I mean, I think people have much more clearly identified this as a problem because of DSM-5. So hopefully going forward there'll be some efforts to reduce that problem and to increase collaboration.
Thank you. Next question is, how do I classify postpartum issues of depression or psychosis? And then there's a second part of the question, was seasonal affective disorder eliminated?
So seasonal affective disorder and postpartum, which is actually now called peripartum depression, because there's a lot of research that shows it starts during pregnancy, not after. And those are specifiers in major depression. And as is, there's a psychosis specifier as well. So that's all in the major depression, major depressive episode, major depression disorder section of depressive disorders. So just take a look in there.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how does the intensity criterion work that is supposed to be a part of all disorder categories now?
So, thank you for that question. One of the hopes that DSM-5 crafters were intending to do was some kind of severity scale. And so they, in the big, not the little mini DSM-5, you know, the pocket DSM-5, but in the big books, if you will, they have some severity scales. Unfortunately, they're not well researched yet. This is part of the living document piece of DSM-5. They, you know, in the rush to publish, they threw stuff in, and I guess they're hoping it'll sort itself out. So sometimes severity indicators are just based on number of symptoms, such as the case with substance abuse, and sometimes they have other ways that they've just divided it up. You know, some have research-based, some don't yet have a research-based. So we'll have to see. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. It is 3:30 Eastern Time right now, and Robin is so kind as to stick around to answer a few more questions. But for those of you who have to leave and are going to be requesting APA continuing education credits, I just direct your attention to the screen right now. There's a code that you're going to need. So Worth Publishers Teaching and Learning Community CE program is approved by the American Psychological Association to sponsor continuing education for psychologists. Whoops, I apologize that I forgot to change the slide, but Robin Rosenberg is an author at Worth Publishers. There's no obvious conflict of interest in today's presentation. For more information, you can email me, amassinio@worthpub.com. I am going to email out a form that you need to fill out. In the form, it's going to ask you for this code. The code is R0401. So it's like Rosenberg, April 1st. So you'll need that for the form, so just make sure you write it down and hold on to it. And again, I am so sorry about changing that slide. How embarrassing. Okay, so back to the question. Actually, I'll leave that on the screen. Back to the next question. The next question is, I just wanted to clarify that PDD-NOS or global development delay is not considered an autism spectrum disorder. Is that correct?
That is correct. PDD-NOS, or what was PDD-NOS, is now called global developmental delay and has its own diagnostic code.
Okay, great. Next question is there a classification of sociopath, or do we look at psychopathy on a continuum? And what is the difference between a psychopath and someone with antisocial personality disorder? And I'll put this question, that was a long question, so I'm going to just type that in the chat box if you want to also.
No, I see it there, yeah. So neither sociopath nor psychopath are DSM diagnoses. The closest you can get is antisocial personality disorder, but antisocial personality disorder is much more of a behavioral disorder. It's based on specific antisocial behaviors, whereas psychopathy or sociopathy is, as it's defined, typically is much more about the underlying issues that drive behaviors. So in prisons, the very high percentage have antisocial personality disorder, but not so many are psychopaths. So I would heartily recommend, if you're interested in sociopathy and psychopathy, that you look up any work by Robert Hare, who has a book called Psychopaths, and he has another great book called Snakes in Suits, about psychopaths in the workplace. But antisocial personality disorder is much more focused on behaviors and less on the underlying traits that are typical of psychopaths.
Thank you. Next question is, when conducting psychological evaluations, where should we put the information that would have previously gone in the multi-axial system? For example, psychosocial stressors.
So really it's up to you now where to put that information, unless you are working either with or at an agency or some other entity that wants it in a new place. This is as of October 1st, so I wouldn't change anything before then. I would continue doing what you're doing until October 1st, and again, pay attention to the news on Thursday about whether they're going to push back the start date even further. But for insurance companies or for agencies, my guess is that by October 1st, they'll be letting you know where they want the information. But if you don't have anyone telling you, I would just put it where you think it best belongs is what I would suggest. But again, just check with the person for whom the evaluation is being written.
Thank you. Next question is, can you speak to the removal of the 5-axis diagnosis and how we go about diagnosing without it?
So for Axis 1 and 2, I think that part is straightforward, which is it's whatever diagnoses the person has or have in DSM-5. I think the idea, my understanding was that in DSM-5, the big book, and I can't remember whether it's in the small book, they have the World Health Organization, the WHODAS, it's called, the World Health Organization Dysfunction, I've forgotten what it stands for, Dysfunction Adaptability Scale. Basically, instead of the GAF, they're using WHODAS, and it is in the big book of the DSM-5 manual. And they also have, in the DSM-5 big book, they have a thing about cultural factors and physical factors. So they're giving you tools, but unlike the multi-axial system where it was really obvious where to put the information and kind of that it was required by some entities, it's much more left to your own devices. So you can always put more information in, but it's not structured in a way that leads you to remember to do it. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Right now I have one more question saved. If you ask the question that I have not asked, feel free to type it in, or if you have something you want to get in before the last few minutes, just send it in. But until then, this is the last question that I have in waiting. That question is, what features would you assess to differentiate disruptive mood dysregulation disorder from intermittent explosive disorder?
That is a great question. I do not see children, and so I know about the differences between the two, but those particular weeds are not ones that I'm familiar enough without looking at them side by side that I would be able to give you that answer. So what I would suggest is that you, in DSM-5, sort of take out both, maybe Xerox, one page, so you can literally hold them side by side and walk through them. I know that they did try to play up the mood pieces, sort of the irritability in disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and then played up the kind of behavioral explosiveness in IED. But I would suggest strongly that you look at those. And someone can have both. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. I don't believe, actually, now that I said that, there may be a caveat in there. That's a really good question, and I would just take a look and read all the criteria really carefully.
Thank you. Actually, I've had a bunch of questions about the PowerPoint presentation, and yes, I will send it to everybody after the presentation. So if you attended, you will receive it. Okay. So, and I have another question for you, Robin. Discuss the dropping of intelligence test measures for intellectual disability.
So they dropped it in the criteria box. They still have kind of general guidelines there, but the shift away from IQ testing, I think, conforms with all of the associations that work with on that population, which is, IQ tests can vary from one sitting to the next, from one testing occasion to another, plus or minus 5 points, and it can make a big difference if they end up falling into another category. And the issue is really, given a limited intellectual functioning, given a lower IQ score or limited cognitive ability, how well can they function? How independently? Can they, change money? Can they handle money? Can they live on their own? So it's much more in line with where all of the research and where the associations with work with people with intellectual disabilities has been going. So they're following the trend of people who have expertise in that area. There are some general IQ guidelines not in the criteria boxes in the big book. but the criteria themselves has really kind of stayed away from that and much more focused on adaptation.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how do we determine levels of pleasure for women who have lack of desire arousal?
Great question. It's typically self-report. And there's a model of female sexuality that's cyclical. So in contrast to the old Masters and Johnson model, which was linear, which was desire, arousal, excitement, plateau, orgasm, that generally didn't work so well for women because it turns out women can be aroused and then feel desire. And an orgasm isn't as important for pleasure. So pleasure is really self-defined by the woman. I mean, there are markers of it physiologically, but they're trying to de-emphasize that in DSM-5.
Thank you. And that is all. Those are all the questions that we have. Robin, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. We're truly appreciative of you spending the time to create this and present it. And to all our attendees, I thank you for coming. I thank you for continuing to support our TLC Symposium program. As always, I will post the materials from the symposium to Faculty Lounge. Here's a link to Faculty Lounge. I will, of course, include that in my follow-up email, so that will be the PowerPoints and the continuing education form and the recording. You could also see the upcoming events via Faculty Lounge. You could log in any time to sign up for webinars or access previous webinar materials. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is WorthPsychTLC. I'll also include that in the email, but this is where you can follow us and get teaching ideas, links to materials, and also keep up with the webinars that we'll be hosting. So thank you, Robin. This was amazing. And
thanks. The pleasure is mine. And hopefully I answered the questions adequately, but, if not, just contact me. If you look in DSM-5 and you can't find an answer, let me know.
Well, thank you. That was really kind of you. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and I'll email you later. Bye.
Bye.